An incident that occurred in Seattle on Christmas Eve shook the entire city. Frank, the homeless man everyone feared as dangerous, shattered all prejudices with his actions that night. But what if we told you that old photo in Frank's pocket would reveal who he really was, leading to an ending none of them expected? Frank Morrison, 68, was Pine Street's most famous homeless man. With his long white beard, tattered clothes, and his old military backpack, he had lived on Seattle's cold streets for 27 years. People would cross the street when they saw him. Children stared in fear. Neighborhood residents constantly tried to call the police and send him away. "This man is dangerous," Mike the grocer would say over and over. "He's scaring our customers." "Our children aren't safe," added Jennifer, the neighbor. "Who knows what he might do?" But Frank had never harmed anyone. He would sit quietly in his corner, watching people pass by. Sometimes he could be seen scavenging for food in trash cans. More often, he would lose himself for hours, staring at a faded photograph he'd pulled from his old bag. Before I tell you this story, I want to ask you something. Have you ever considered what that person you see on the street has gone through in the past? What pain they've endured, what sacrifices they've made? Frank's story is one that challenges our preconceptions. The Johnson family, who lived on Pine Street, were among the neighborhood's most disturbed by Frank. Robert, Susan, and their 8-year-old son, Tommy. Robert was a middle-class American who worked for an insurance company. Every morning, he would see Frank on the corner, and he would get angry. "Why is this man still here?" he would mutter. "Why isn't the city doing anything?" Susan disagreed. She actually felt sorry for Frank, but she couldn't speak up because of her husband and the neighbors. Tommy, on the other hand, was both afraid and curious about Frank. His childlike mind was constantly filled with questions. Why does this man live here? Doesn't he have a family? Why did this happen? One cold Saturday in December, Tommy was coming home from school when he saw Frank at his usual spot. This time, something was different. Frank was crying. He had that old photo in his hand again, but this time, the tears were streaming down his beard. Tommy paused. His mother had said, "Never talk to homeless people," but his curiosity was stronger. He approached slowly. "Sir, are you all right?" Frank looked up. It was the first time anyone had addressed him with kindness. There was surprise in his eyes. I'm all right, son. Thank you." "Who's that photo?" Tommy asked innocently. Frank looked at the photo. In the faded, yellowed photograph was a young soldier, a beautiful woman, and a little girl. They were all smiling. This is my family, son. It was a long time ago. Where are they now?" Tears welled in Frank's eyes again. They're not here anymore." Tommy was about to ask something else when his mother's voice was heard. "Tommy, get out of there now." Susan came running and pulled her son away from Frank. "How many times have I told you, don't talk to this man?" Frank bowed his head. The same scene again. The same rejection. The same loneliness again. That evening, the Johnsons discussed Frank over dinner. Robert was angry. "That man was talking to our child. This is unacceptable." "Maybe he's harmless," Susan said quietly. "Harmless? Susan, he's homeless. Who knows what he's been through, what he's done?" "I don't want Tommy talking to him." But Tommy wouldn't listen. Frank's teary eyes and that picture were constantly on his mind. The man just looked lonely, not dangerous. Days passed. Frank followed his usual routine, waking up early in the morning, getting a free breakfast from the nearby church, sitting in his corner all day, and trying to sleep at the shelter in the evening. But the shelter was often full, and Frank was forced to spend the night on the streets. As Christmas approached, the neighborhood took on a completely different atmosphere. Houses were decorated with lights, and children ran and played, waiting for gifts. Frank watched everything from afar. Christmas brought both his fondest and most painful memories to him. Christmas 1972. He was Sergeant Frank Morrison then. He had just returned from Vietnam. It was the first Christmas he would spend with his wife, Sarah, and their 5-year-old daughter, Emily, after the war. How happy he was then. He would leave the trauma of war behind and focus on his family life. But fate had it otherwise. December 23, 1972, Seattle. A drunk driver had failed to stop at a red light. Sarah and Emily were returning from shopping. Gift packages were in the back seat of the car. Emily was on the phone with her mother, telling her about the gift she had bought for her father. They called Frank at the moment of the accident. By the time he rushed to the hospital, it was too late. Sarah had died at the scene. Emily had joined the Angels after struggling in intensive care for 3 days. Frank's world had fallen apart that day. He had seen death in the war, he had lost friends. But nothing had hurt as much as losing his family. PTSD, depression, alcoholism. Everything had come one after another. He lost his job, he lost his home, he lost himself. 27 years had passed since then. Frank was living on the streets, the only thing left of his old life being that photo in his pocket. On Christmas Eve, an unexpected blizzard hit Seattle. The temperatures dropped below freezing. Frank's usual shelter was full, and he had to stay outside. But this time, it was much colder. Around midnight, the snow became even heavier. Frank tried to keep from freezing on his corner on Pine Street. He wrapped himself in a few newspapers and an old blanket, but it wasn't enough. His breath was fogging, and his hands were turning purple. Just then, he heard a distant sound. A child's voice. The sound of crying. Frank stood up. He looked through the snowstorm in the direction of the sound. It came from a few blocks away. Normally, Frank wouldn't have intervened. People were afraid of him and the risk of being misunderstood. But this time, it was different. That voice sounded like Emily's. Frank grabbed his bag and started walking through the blizzard in the direction of the sound. The cold burned his face, but he didn't care. With every step, the sound became clearer. 2 blocks later, he saw a little boy next to an old building. It was Tommy, the Johnson family's son. He was crouched in the corner, shivering and crying. He wore only a thin coat. Frank rushed to him. "Kid! What happened? Why are you here?" Tommy looked up. He was startled when he saw Frank, but he was so cold he couldn't run. I'm lost. I was trying to get home, but I couldn't find my way because of the snow. I'm so cold." Frank didn't think twice. He took off his only warm jacket and put it over Tommy. Then he picked him up. "Don't worry, son. I'll take you home. What street do you live on?" "On Pine Street. 245. Frank smiled. It was ironic. Tommy was the son of the house he'd lived in for 27 years. The blizzard was raging, but Frank wrapped Tommy tightly around him and started walking. The boy tried to stay warm on Frank's chest. He wasn't afraid anymore. He didn't think Frank would hurt him. He just felt warm and safe. "Sir," Tommy said, his voice trembling, "are you a good person?" Tears welled up in Frank's eyes. "I don't know, son. I used to think I was a good person. I still think you're a good person. Bad people wouldn't save me." These words hit Frank like an arrow. No one had called him a good person in 27 years. When they arrived on Pine Street, the Johnson family was panicking, searching the street for Tommy. Robert, flashlight in hand, and Susan crying and shouting her son's name. "Tommy! Tommy, where are you?" Susan froze in shock when she saw her son in Frank's arms. Robert was equally shocked. Frank gently lowered Tommy to the ground. The boy ran to his mother and hugged her. "Mom! This man saved me. I was lost and so cold. He found me and brought me home." Susan and Robert looked at each other, not quite understanding what had happened. I don't know how to thank you, Susan said. Tommy could have been frozen. Frank shook his head. No need. Anyone would have done the same thing. No, Robert said. There was regret in his voice. Not everyone would have. I was so mean to you. I'm sorry. Frank smiled. It's okay. I understand. Tommy took off Frank's jacket and wanted to give it to him, but Frank held up his hand. You hold it, kid. I don't need it. But you're cold too. Susan stepped forward. Please, come in. Have a hot cup of coffee. You shouldn't be out in this weather. Frank was surprised. No one had invited him home in 27 years. I don't want to. Don't bother. I insist, Robert said. You saved Tommy. We can at least keep you warm. Frank hesitated, but the cold was intense. He agreed. The warmth of the Johnson house was heavenly to Frank. Susan offered him hot coffee and fresh cookies. Tommy didn't leave his side. Sir, can I see your daughter in that photo? Tommy asked. Frank pulled the photo out of his pocket. Tommy looked at it intently. She's beautiful. How old was she? Emily. She was your age. 8. Where is she now? Tears welled up in Frank's eyes. Susan and Robert were listening now. She and her mother died in an accident a long time ago. 2 days before Christmas. A heavy silence fell in the room. Tears welled in Tommy's eyes. Is that why you're sad at Christmas? Frank nodded. Yeah, kid. Christmas was so special to them. Susan could stand it no longer. How awful. I'm so sorry. Frank looked at the photo. Emily was a curious girl like you. She was always asking questions. You're so much like her. Tommy sat down next to him. Do you miss them? Every day, kid. Every second. Robert leaned forward. Were you in the military? Yeah. I fought in Vietnam. I was Sergeant Frank Morrison. But those are old stories now. Are you a Vietnam veteran? Robert's voice was filled with surprise. Yes. But that doesn't matter anymore. Robert stood up. Now he looked at Frank with completely different eyes. I'm ashamed we left heroes like you out on the street. Frank smiled bitterly. I'm not a hero. I'm just a man who lost his life. No, said Tommy. You saved me. That makes you a hero. That night, Frank stayed at the Johnson house. He slept in a warm bed for the first time in 27 years. When he woke up, he looked at the photo of Emily and Sarah. Maybe it's time, he whispered. The next day, Christmas Day, a big change took place on Pine Street. The Johnson family had taken action for Frank. Robert talked to his co-workers, Susan convinced the neighbors, and Tommy told his friends at school about Frank's story. By evening, the entire neighborhood had raised money for Frank. They rented a small apartment, bought essential furniture. But most importantly, they had given Frank a family. As Frank walked to his new home, holding Tommy's hand, he touched the photo in his pocket. Emily, I still think your father is a good man, he whispered. That evening, Frank had his first happy Christmas in 27 years. He had dinner with the Johnson family, opened presents, and played games with Tommy. And most importantly, he was no longer alone. After the neighborhood residents learned Frank's true story, they began to see him in completely different eyes. He was no longer the dangerous homeless man but Frank the hero neighbor. Frank's story spread throughout Seattle. The local newspaper wrote about it, and television reported on it. But more than being famous, Frank was happy to have a family again. Tommy became his best friend. He visited Frank every day, reading to him, playing checkmate. Frank told Tommy stories of his bravery in Vietnam and taught him life lessons. Months passed. Frank's life had changed completely. Now he lived in a small apartment, received regular help, and received psychological support. But most importantly, he felt valued again. A year later, on that same Christmas Eve, Frank was walking down Pine Street with Tommy. It was snowing again, but this time Frank wouldn't be in the cold, but in the warmth of his own home. "Uncle Frank," Tommy said, "do you think Emily and her mother see you're happy?" Frank looked up at the sky. Snowflakes brushed his face. "I'm sure they do, son. And I think they're happy too." "How do you know?" "Because you came into my life. You became my Emily. And that's the best gift they ever sent me." Tommy smiled. "Then I'll be your Uncle Tommy." Frank laughed. For the first time in 28 years, he laughed heartily. This story teaches us an important lesson: never judge by appearances. The homeless person you see on the street might be the hero who saves your life. The person in need might be someone who has given their life for your country in the past. Frank's story is still told in Seattle. He now lives in the neighborhood as a respected older brother, a seasoned mentor. And every Christmas Eve, he and Tommy go to that old corner and help the other homeless people who meet there. Because Frank now knows that sometimes, all it takes is showing someone you care to change their life. And Tommy? He grew up to be a kind, unprejudiced, and helpful young man with a heart like his father. The most important lesson Frank taught him was, don't judge people until you know their story. Because everyone has one, and often that story will surprise you. Do you wonder what happened to Frank at the end of that story? He still lives in Seattle. He's 75 now. Tommy is studying social work in college. The two are still best friends, and Frank still calls Tommy son. And every Christmas Eve, the two of them walk down Pine Street together, watching the snowflakes, and smiling at the photo of Emily and Sarah. Because sometimes life's best gifts come at the most unexpected times and from the most unexpected people.